Imagine you're standing on the Nile Delta at dawn, around 1177 BC. The water is dark, the air is still. Then ships appear on the horizon, not traders, not fishermen, but strangers Egypt would carve into stone as a nightmare. And after more than 3,000 years, we still don't know what they really were: invaders, refugees, or the sea peoples. To understand why this mattered, picture the ancient world as a giant machine. Egypt was one part of it. The Hittite Empire was another. Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, Ugarit, Canaan, all of them were connected by grain, copper, tin, letters, ships, and promises. It wasn't globalization like we know it today. No phones, no cargo planes, no internet. But for the Bronze Age, it was a web. A fragile one. Kings wrote to each other. Cities depended on trade. Armies depended on food. Palaces depended on workers. And bronze itself depended on metals that often came from far away. Take away the grain, and people panic. Take away the tin, and weapons get harder to make. Take away the ships, and whole cities lose the thing keeping them alive. So you'd think one battle couldn't bring all of that down, right? But here's the thing. By the end of the 13th century BC, that whole machine was already shaking. Cities were burning. Trade routes were failing. Kingdoms were under pressure. And then, in Egyptian records, a new enemy appears from the sea. The clearest picture we have comes from Medinet Habu, a temple complex built by Pharaoh Ramesses III. On its walls, Egypt carved a victory story. Ramesses standing tall, enemy ships crushed in the Nile Delta, warriors dragged down, chaos turned into order. It's dramatic, almost too dramatic. One famous line from the inscription says that no land could stand before their arms. That's how Egypt wanted this enemy remembered. Unstoppable, terrifying, almost like a storm with helmets and swords. And the names are still strange today. Peliset, Cheker, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh. Not one people, several groups. Now imagine being an Egyptian soldier looking out at the water. You don't know their language, you don't know their homeland. You just see ships, spears, shields, and behind them, maybe the end of everything you've been told will last forever. But Egypt wasn't the only place in trouble. Far to the north, the city of Ugarit was falling apart. And this is where the story stops feeling like a stone carving and starts feeling human. Ugarit's last king, Ammurapi, wrote desperate letters as the crisis closed in. In one message, he says enemy ships had come, his cities had been burned, and his troops were somewhere else. Think about that. Not a historian writing centuries later, not a myth. A king in real time, basically saying, the enemy is here, my city is burning, and I don't have help. In one letter, there were 7 enemy ships. In another context, 20. Small numbers, maybe, but if your soldiers are gone and your coast is exposed, 7 ships can be enough. And then comes the detail that changes the whole image. On the Egyptian reliefs, some of these people aren't shown as just warriors. There are women, children, ox carts, families moving with the fighters. That doesn't look like a simple raid. It looks like migration. Maybe some were attackers, maybe some were fleeing. Maybe both things were true at the same time. Because around this same period, another pressure was building. Tree ring evidence from Anatolia points to a severe dry spell around 1198 to 1196 BC. 3 bad years may not sound like much now, but in a palace system built on harvests, storage, and control, 3 bad years could break trust, break food supplies, and break armies. And remember, these were not small village systems. These were royal networks, temples, storehouses, scribes, soldiers, farmers, merchants, and ports, all leaning on each other. If a palace couldn't collect grain, it couldn't feed workers. If it couldn't feed workers, it couldn't build, trade, or fight. If ships stopped moving, a city that looked rich could suddenly become trapped. That's the scary part. A collapse doesn't always start with one huge explosion. Sometimes it starts with smaller failures piling up until the system can't breathe. The Bronze Age was like a chain stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt, the Hittites, Cyprus, Ugarit, Mycenaean Greece, each link pulling on the next. And when several links snapped at once, It didn't matter which one broke first. The whole chain started to fall. But here's where the old story starts to crack. For years, the easy version was this. Mysterious warriors came from the sea, smashed the great kingdoms, and ended the Bronze Age. Clean, simple, almost cinematic. But history rarely breaks that neatly. Scientists still don't know exactly where all the sea peoples came from. They don't even agree on whether they were one movement, several migrations, loose bands of fighters, or desperate families pushed out by a collapsing world. The Egyptian records show enemies. Of course they do. Egypt was writing a victory story. But the archaeology tells a messier one. In 2019, researchers studied DNA from Ashkelon, a city linked to the Philistines. They looked at the genomes of 10 people from the Bronze Age and Iron Age, and they found a signal of movement from the Mediterranean world. So yes, people really were moving by sea. But no, that doesn't mean all the sea peoples came from one place. It doesn't mean they were one nation, and it doesn't mean they alone destroyed the Bronze Age. Turns out they may have been the most visible part of a much bigger breakdown. Raiders? Maybe. Refugees? Maybe. Scapegoats? Also possible. Because if drought is hitting farms, trade is failing, palaces are losing control, and cities can't protect themselves, then people move. Some run, some fight, some do both. And from the point of view of Egypt, all of that could look like one thing: an invasion. But from the point of view of the people on those carts, it may have looked like survival. Egypt survived the battle. That's important. Ramesses III could carve victory into stone. And for a while, it looked like the kingdom had held the line. But survival isn't the same as strength. After these wars, Egypt entered a long decline. The old Bronze Age world never really came back. The Hittite Empire was gone. Ugarit was gone. Mycenaean Greece changed forever. The network that had tied kings, ports, metals, grain, and armies together had snapped. And about 2 decades later, Ramesses III himself was killed in a palace conspiracy. So maybe the real lesson isn't that the sea peoples destroyed civilization. Maybe the lesson is darker. Civilizations don't always fall because one enemy breaks through the gate. Sometimes they fall because the food system weakens, the trade routes fail, the rulers lose trust, the weather turns, and then frightened people start moving across the map. One crack becomes 5. 5 become 50. And by the time the ships appear on the horizon, the collapse has already begun. That's what makes this story feel so modern. The Bronze Age world was ancient, but it wasn't simple. It was connected, dependent, fragile, just like ours.